there's Natalie. So, thing number one, I'm still grading, which seems like it's taking forever, at least on my end, but there are 300 things for me to grade. There's 100 of you, not in this class, but in all 3 of mine, and 3 questions. So 2 down, 1 to go. So hopefully I'll finish the 3rd one tomorrow, tonight and tomorrow. My guess is tomorrow. I don't think I can stay up that late tonight. Thing number 2, what I'm noticing, most of you, plenty of detail. Some of you, a lot of detail about stuff that doesn't answer the question. So, I mean, I get that you maybe want to create a background, and that makes sense. I mean, to set the historical stage, it does. But, I mean, some of you are going back to Christopher Columbus, to Thomas Jefferson. You don't have to set that much of a stage. I mean, just talk about the Gilded Age. Overstatement seems to be a bit of an issue, like this was the worst thing that ever happened. This is the worst abuse of anyone ever in the world. Like, that's too much. Certainly the way we treated Native Americans was bad. I mean, all you have to do really is describe it. You don't have to tell me it was the worst thing that ever happened in the world. We'll get the idea if you just describe what happened. And as far as was it the worst thing that ever, I have no idea. I mean, you guys get to decide what the worst thing that ever happened was in your opinion, but I don't know how we ever decide things like that. And stuff like, this changed the United States forever. Okay, I get it. But don't say that kind of stuff too often unless you're talking about Constitution or creation of the nuclear weapons, or, you know, it has to be a really big thing, and you can't say that very often because, you know, it loses its punch if you say this was the most influential thing and, you know, this changed the world forever. I suppose everything changes the world forever if you want to look at it that way. So, you know what I'm saying. And also, here's a weird thing. Not trying to be rude at all, but how we feel about stuff. How would you feel if you were a Native American? How would you feel in this situation? Wrong class. So save that more for your English class. It just, for introductions, more what else is going on at the same time makes more sense than how would you feel if this happened to you? Because, you know, again, wrong class. Not that we're not concerned about your feelings completely, it's just not as strong of an argument here as it would be when you're interpreting literature. And of course, the point of literature, I know it's partly to instruct, teach you moral lessons, but it's also to make you have feelings about certain topics. Sorry, I have to have some caffeine. Just for the record, Coke Zero. I don't want you to get distressed. But the feelings, you know, more for somewhere else. Maybe even government, I don't know. You have a government professor that lets you talk about your feelings, but we're weird like that in the history department. Also, I know, I mean, I taught high school forever, so I know that the style of writing that you're taught, the type of writing you're taught, very rarely relates to history. And then sometimes you have the world history class where they tell you it doesn't matter if you say stuff that's incorrect, as long as you say a whole bunch of stuff. It's sort of like the spaghetti test. You throw it against the wall and see what sticks, and the stuff that doesn't stick, the stuff that's incorrect, doesn't affect you. Yeah, not so true here, because if you say things that aren't correct, then I don't know that you have strong historical knowledge. And it's different than an AP test because you know ahead of time what to study. On the AP exam, there's, you know, 100 things that can come up and you only have one test. Here you have a weekly assignment and a quiz that I give you a list of stuff to study for. So it should be, you should have a better idea here. So you shouldn't make as many mistakes here. So if you, especially on weekly questions where you can look all the stuff up. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. All right, so also other stuff. I may or may not have mentioned we may have some interruptions in class next week. It seems to me like your class should be okay. I have surgery on Monday and the follow-up on Tuesday. So I think we'll be okay for class. If not, I will send you an email that says, hey, don't bother, just watch the recording, okay? But look for the email or the announcement. Don't just assume. Assume we will have class unless I tell you we won't. And that would be, of course, the way it would be in person as well. All right, before we start talking about weekly questions and such, do you have any questions you would like to ask while I drink Coke Zero? I don't know, do we need to elect a class spokesperson. You guys should take turns though. Because you always, I think you made Connor do it last time.
I don't think we have any questions.
Okay, all right, Matthew. Now, is this like a sexist thing? Because typically it's the guys who are the class spokesperson. Are we okay here? It's not a sexist thing.
What?
It's not sexist that we always have guys as the class. No, it's just the guys are paying attention, right? Do you think the women are paying attention?
We are.
Okay, all right. Thank you for being the spokesperson for the women. All right. Now we've got the men and the women covered for spokespeople. We'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, I know it's end of the day. I know you're tired. Me too. My goodness. But let me go ahead and share the stuff and we'll see where we're headed. All right. Getting close. All right. Today's the weekly question for this chapter, not that chapter, not 20. Sorry. 19, where I didn't make enough notes, did I? Is explain the reasons for and describe U.S. participation in World War I. Describe how World War I transformed the roles of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. I was talking about this with the earlier classes, and here's a thought. You can argue that it didn't, that it only temporarily transformed the roles. You can argue that it didn't really at all. Things I would be careful about. Sorry, my neck hurts. Overstatement once again. Don't say like it completely changes the lives of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans forever. That's too much. But it does temporarily give all of these groups different places in the workforce where they may or may not be treated better for a short period of time or a long period of time. Might be an opening to civil rights, an opening to equality. It might be where people achieved equality, but I'm not expecting that in the 19 teens. And honestly, you shouldn't either. It's kind of early for that. And some of you would argue that that hasn't even happened yet. So, you know, don't go overboard on this. The thought is for women that they will enter the workforce to take the place of the men who were drafted. And then when the men come back, excuse me, then the women will go back home. And that is typically what happens. Now, younger generations of women will follow kind of that Charlotte Perkins Gilman, get some equality, get a job kind of advice. And then you'll see that flapper generation in the 20s. But you also have to realize most women were not flappers, although they're still an important segment of society because they're the ones in the news. They're the Kardashians of the time period, or whoever it is that you guys pay attention to. I really honestly don't know. Cardi B, do you pay attention to Cardi B? I don't know who you pay attention to. Some girl with blue hair that I saw who was hosting a music show. I don't know who she is, but apparently she's quite trendy. Maybe you follow her. But flappers were the it persons of the time period. So even though they weren't a majority of people, they had an audience. Who's the blue-haired girl? Do you know? She's youngish. She looks like 20 or so. All right, you can tell me later, blue-haired girl. She's a singer of some sort.
Is it Billie Eilish?
It is. She looks so unhappy. Is she unhappy? I just saw her on it. I'm sorry, say it again.
She could be. I don't know.
I think it's more of a stage character. I think it's a persona that she plays.
Okay, so she's, okay, all right. As long as she's not unhappy, I'm glad for her. No, I saw a commercial with her and I thought, oh, she just looks unhappy, but that's okay. Blue hair is nice, so I'm not opposed to blue hair. All right, and I know she probably has money, which is sometimes helpful, so Flappers didn't always have money.
She has lots of money. Plenty.
I assumed she was okay financially. One thing I have noticed about people who earn their money at that age is sometimes when they're at my age, they don't have any of it left. So when you guys get wealthy at a young age, remember, put some of it aside, okay? Because you may need it later. It's true. All right.
Yeah, she's 18.
18, dang. Okay, well, good for her. So hope she's not unhappy. But okay, we're not supposed to talk about this. You've seen some of those people who are, earn that money that early, and they are like super unhappy. So good luck to you, blue-haired Billie Eilish. Okay, let's talk about why the United States gets into World War I. You already know because we talked about it last time. Zimmerman note. So when you're answering the weekly question, don't talk about the blue-haired girl. Instead, talk about the Zimmerman telegram. You can talk about the other stuff too. I won't be upset if you talk about the Lusitania or other ships that get sunk or general interruption of shipping in the Atlantic. But please, 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 please mention the Zimmerman telegram because that's probably the main thing that caused us to get involved. Also, you might consider mentioning the 14 points because Wilson does say these are the reasons that we're going to war, and he gives 14 points. So there have to be a few reasons in there that are useful, hopefully. So, and then there's the little summary of the 14 points in my notes. There's more information about them in the book, but freedom of the seas, free trade, those things kind of go together. Self-determination, which is really about getting to decide who lives in your country and how it's ruled, which sounds good on the surface, but beneath the surface is a little bit about creating ethnic nations, which are ethnic states, which is, isn't exactly what we do here, but certainly was trendy in Europe during the time period. Treaties without clauses, and creating the League of Nations, which we will not exactly join. Colonialism, where you take colonies, take over other people's land. We're going to modify it. Okay, you've already heard this talking about. All right. So how does us joining the war transform society, groups in general? You might argue that it unifies us in some ways, that we're going to be unified in disliking Germans. So we have some anti-German propaganda that's going to push us to feel like Germans are evil and that they need to be defeated. So most people in the United States are going to get behind the war effort, which also explains why they tolerated the Espionage and Sedition Act during the time period. And you could argue if you want that this is not a great time for people pushing for labor rights because they tend to be lumped in with communist, socialist, anti-war type people because a lot of labor union leaders said, hey, the draft isn't fair. They disproportionately draft poor people. So perhaps we should resist the draft. And then people said, perhaps you are not a real American. And then they got mad at them. Yeah, more than got mad at them, put them in jail and deported them. For women, I think we already mentioned, they're going to go to work briefly and assume more responsibility at work and probably at home as well. As far as decision making, that's probably, and earning money, that will probably be a short-term change for women in this era. Although there will be some women who say like, hey, that wasn't so bad. Maybe I will stay in the workforce. Or if they were younger women, they would say, hey, I will stay single. If you're wondering, like, were there a lot of women who said, you know what, I don't need that dude anyway, and they divorced him? Not so much. Now, your book will talk about in the 20s how divorce rates double, and that's true, they do, but they go from like 4 to 8% of people being married getting divorced. So, I mean, that's noticeable, but it's not anything like the modern era. The assumption during this era, during the 20s, during the 30s, during the 40s, during the 50s, is that women will get married and their primary responsibilities to their family as a wife and mother, not as a bread earner. Bread earner, do you still say that? Bread earner? You guys don't even eat carbs. Bunch of kids don't eat carbs. So you don't need a bread earner, breadwinner. Okay. But women are supposed to be in the home still, pretty much. But, you know, that'll change a little after World War II. But we'll talk more about that later, won't we? Of course we will. All right. If you're wondering, do things improve for African Americans? A little, maybe. Some African Americans will get drafted. They may have some opportunities in the military that they didn't have before. It won't be as dramatic as what you'll see with World War II. They may serve in places that are desegregated, but you have to remember, we joined the war effort late, so 1917, and we really fight for about a year. So we are not as involved in this war as we are World War II. World War II changes things dramatically, in large part because we're involved in it longer. And I would mention, when you talk about African Americans, that African Americans in substantial numbers, not a majority, but substantial numbers, will relocate from the South to the North for defense industry jobs, so they can go make stuff for the war effort. And if you're wondering, will they be well received in the northern cities where they move? Not so much, not so much. So the book will talk about different issues that have to do with race, as there's an African American migration or relocation or diaspora. Okay, I know that I probably mentioned this last time, but I was just thinking about it because the book is handy. I'm sure your book is right next to your computer as well. The section about the war effort starts on page 746. And it's, it's fairly substantial. So it goes to the end of the chapter. Excuse me for the sigh there. There's no reason for that. But it goes through about 777. So about 30 pages worth of stuff. If you look at the subject headings, the section headings, it'll be super helpful to you, I think. I think it will. So things that unified us, our efforts to help with the war, bond sales, food saving efforts like meatless Tuesdays and wheatless Wednesdays. The book talks about how the law sort of forced people to be patriotic. I think that's probably true. You could also talk about eugenics. The book has a little section about eugenics, how this made, it sort of legitimized racism briefly as a science, as the result of a science, not that racism is a science, but that different races are superior or inferior, and we can prove that with science because eugenics was seen as science. And eugenics is it's kind of what I just said, isn't it? The idea that it's like survival of the fittest for people. And so that some people are just genetically superior to others. And I don't mean like in my family, if you're taller than 5'2", maybe you're genetically superior because we're a bunch of short people. But I mean, that certain races are superior, or that maybe men's brains are, more capable than women's brains. And they'll devise some sort of pseudoscience behind that, sort of like phrenology. Do you remember? You probably talked about phrenology in world history, where they talked about how the shape of your head determined, how you were, if you were intelligent or not, and if your forehead was a certain width, or if your nose, I don't know, it's just sort of weird stuff. But that really all kind of went together with what race or ethnicity you were. But eugenics will be it'll definitely be an issue in the United States. And they'll talk about different contests like perfect baby contests and breeding associations. And they'll talk about laws that made it possible to sterilize certain people against their will so that they wouldn't reproduce. So, I mean, there's some rough stuff going on in this time period. And the sections that start on 760 talk about the different ethnic groups, anti-German stuff, Wilson and ethnicity, that sort of thing. So just make sure you peek in there, and talks a little bit as well about how there's a large immigration of Mexican Americans during this time period, and a push for more rights in Puerto Rico, and a push for desegregation of some schools in California so that Asians and whites could go to school together. So lots of stuff in the book to help you out with the question. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about? Oh, we probably want to talk about Marcus Garvey for a little while, and maybe W.E.B. We'll definitely go back and talk about W.E.B. more as we talk more about the 20s, because W.E.B. Du Bois is around for a really long time. Marcus Garvey's around for a shorter period of time. He's really popular, trendy during this era, and pushes something. Sorry, I know what he pushes. I'm looking at my book to see if they have a picture of him. I think he's such an interesting fellow. But Marcus Garvey, oh, here he is. But no picture. Oh my gosh, what the heck is wrong with the textbook? No picture of Marcus Garvey. But Marcus Garvey leads a movement primarily in New York, in Harlem area neighborhood, of parades and demonstrations of Black pride, and he talks about what is freedom for African Americans. And a lot of people, and the book mentions this, don't really like Marcus Garvey that much because he's uneducated or he's not formally educated. He's an immigrant from Jamaica, and he argues just kind of generally that makes more sense for African Americans to push for economic independence rather than desegregation, and to explore their roots in Africa and the greatness of the history of African nations. So kind of pushes, it's sort of an early Black pride sort of movement, and it's really kind of interesting. He is rejected by more intellectual members of the progressive era, like W.E.B. Du Bois, but he's certainly very popular in Harlem and in other large cities in the United States where there are large African American populations. He'll start something called the Black Star Cruise Line, and that creates cruises, vacations, trips to Africa, different African nations, so that people can explore their African heritage. It's kind of the early version of Pan-Africanism, a movement to unite people of African descent throughout the world, to reclaim heritage, that sort of thing. And he ends up getting charged, arrested, and convicted of embezzlement from his own company, which may or may not have been accurate because lots of people got set up during this time period if they were politically unpopular, which is hard to believe that people who are politically unpopular might get set up by the government. I know that you cannot imagine that. All right, so Marcus Garvey. All right, let me just kind of peek through the notes here. We've already talked about most of this stuff last time. Yes, I feel like we did. So you know that Woodrow Wilson maybe screened a super racist movie at the White House, which is going to be your clue that Woodrow Wilson's not going to be good about issues of race for African Americans. The NAACP becomes more active because lynching is still a problem and equality isn't being achieved, and 14th Amendment is not being enforced, 15th in the South. So, you know, there's a push by the NAACP to get the Supreme Court to require the United States government to enforce, I don't know, the law. Yeah, to enforce the law. That's going to take a while. And also to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. When that happens, we'll talk about it a lot because it's hugely important. And then I know we've already mentioned that there are race riots that occur as larger populations of African Americans move to the North from the South. So no happy news here today. And as the war ends, Woodrow Wilson wants the United States to join the League of Nations and to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. So, do you guys know anything about how the United States government decides if we're going to ratify a treaty or not? Whose decision is that? We either need a spokesperson to say something or in the chat. How do we decide in the United States that we are saying okay to or ratifying a treaty? Whose decision is that? How do we know that the US government has said yes to a treaty? Any thoughts?
It's the president, right?
It's a really smart guess. And in this instance, the president actually negotiated the treaty, which sometimes it's the Secretary of State. The House, you're so close, which means it's the other half of the legislature. Yep, it's the Senate. So this is a tricky situation because our president wrote this treaty and created the League of Nations. Now, the Senate, more powerful, should I say that? It's more powerful than the House. It has different powers. And, excuse me, you'll have the nice government class next year. So you'll get reminded of all this stuff. Or did you ever study this stuff? Is this maybe a 5th grade thing? And you talk about the Constitution a little bit in 8th grade, but probably you just talk about people's rights and stuff because those are more fun. Plus it's Texas, so you all know the Second Amendment. In the Constitution, you know, it says what powers each branch of the government has, and we're supposed to have a shared, or not shared, but a balance of powers between the 3 branches and also between the federal government and the state government. So the executive branch, the president's the head of that, has the power to negotiate treaties. Either the president does that or sometimes the Secretary of State or whoever the president designates, but that has to be approved by the Senate. It has to be ratified by the Senate. And that has to be a 2/3 majority for a treaty. And then, of course, the judicial branch, rarely comes into play as far as treaties unless they think that something that we have signed violates the Constitution. Because in general, the Supreme Court decides constitutionality of stuff or if laws have been misapplied. So Senate gets the power to ratify treaties. They also, as you're about to notice, confirm Supreme Court justices. They also confirm other presidential appointees. The House gets to start bills of appropriations. I couldn't think of the word, where you spend money, appropriation. And the Senate's the one where you get 2 people per state, and the House is the one where you get more people if you have more people in your state. Okay, which leads me to question number 2 for group participation today. Do you have any idea who the senators are for the great state of Texas? Any thoughts about who our senators are? Your current president suggested one of them could be on the Supreme Court. So
Is it Ted Cruz and John Cornyn, right?
there
Something
you
like that?
go, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. So some older guys who are pretty good lawyers. Both of them have been, well, no, Ted Cruz, I think, was Solicitor General. And then John Cornyn was, what was John Cornyn? What's the word? He was the big lawyer, the one,
Attorney General?
Attorney General, the big lawyer. Thank you. Sorry, I'm really tired. I apologize. So thank you. I think we're going to put you in charge of class today. Yeah, I know. Connor's the winner for sure. And again, don't I owe him like a free question already? I wrote his name down from last time.
Oh, we do?
I don't know. I feel like I wrote something down from last time because you answered all the questions. I don't know. Connor gets an
Yeah,
extra point.
you said that you're gonna give him a free question.
I know, it seems like I should though. If Connor needs a break at all, I think he gets it, don't you guys? I think it's only fair. All right, so John Cornyn and Ted Cruz are our senators, and very nice. You've got support from the class too, Connor. That's nice. All right, So let's get back to 19 teens business. So Woodrow Wilson goes overseas to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles and get people to agree to the League of Nations. He's hailed as an international hero. It's like, oh, he's so brilliant. What a great treaty. This is amazing. Woodrow Wilson's our guy. Comes back to the United States and the Senate says, hey, buddy. No, they don't say, hey, buddy. Hey, Mr. President. We have some concerns about your treaty. And he goes, what? I'm the hero of the treaty. You cannot have concerns about my treaty. Plus, remember, he had been a college professor, and we're always right. And he's as great as it is to be the adjunct professor of history at ACC. This guy had been the president of Princeton, which might even be a little more important than adjunct professor of history at ACC. So this guy was not used to being told that he was wrong. So, and he's not used to having to negotiate. So when he comes home and people say like, hey, buddy, we need to talk about your treaty. He goes, you know what? You don't ratify my treaty. I will go to your district and I will campaign against you. And people like me more than they like you. So you will lose your job. Wow. So he was threatening people. Can you imagine a politician that threatens people and thinks he's smarter than everyone else and won't negotiate? Thankfully, we've never had politicians like that since that time period. Actually, I was reading some article that said only narcissists will run for president. It's like, well, maybe. I don't know. But Woodrow Wilson didn't want to be argued with. And also, it's possible that he'd had a mild stroke while he was overseas negotiating the treaty. And if you're wondering, like, what does that have to do with whether or not we should ratify the treaty or why he's cranky? Sometimes strokes can alter your temperament a little bit or enhance certain parts of your temperament. Wilson was already kind of in the don't argue with me, I'm always right mode, and this may have enhanced it. Now, if you're wondering why in the world would Congress, the Senate in particular, be unhappy with Wilson's treaty? What about it did they not like? Here's some thoughts, unless you have some thoughts. We let Connor share his thoughts too, because his thoughts have been so good lately. And the rest of yours too, I'm sure. You're just not sharing them as much. The Treaty of Versailles created the League of Nations. The League of Nations is an international government that hopefully would stop future world wars. It would do that by negotiating, by quarantining certain nations, and not like we're quarantining now with masks and social distancing, but economic quarantining. Like if you do something the rest of the world doesn't want you to do, the rest of the world says, we are not trading with that person anymore, so you can't sell stuff and you can't buy stuff. That could be a problem. The other thing you could do to keep a nation in line is send troops there to physically keep them in line. So if we're going to give the League of Nations the power to send troops somewhere, we're going to have to create troops for the League of Nations. To do that, each member nation would have to pledge a certain part of its military to go when the entire group said we're going to send troops. The US government, the Congress, the Senate in this instance, was not excited about that provision. There were other provisions some of them didn't like, but this is the big sticking point. Can you think of any reasons why our Senate, our Congress, but the Senate in particular would say, no, we are not going to let the League of Nations send our troops somewhere? Do you have any thoughts about this? Why would they not want to do that? Because if the whole league agreed, it must be a good reason, right? Maybe?
Because it might not be in the US's interest.
That's pretty much it. And that, of course, is why we have a government, typically, is to operate in our best interest. I know we would like for it to be lovely and hug the neighbors and all that kind of stuff, but you have a government to preserve the best interest of your country. So the Senate's concerned that the League of Nations, what if they gang up on the United States? What if they decide the US is being kind of a bully, so we're going to use the troops against the US? What if we had to send our own troops against ourselves? It could be a problem. Plus, in our system, who gets to decide when and where we send troops? Do you have any thoughts about that? Who declares war? How is war declared? Do you know?
Like the president's commander in chief.
He is, and that's a very important thing to bring up. So the president is commander in chief of the military. Now we kind of set that up on purpose so that the military can't go rogue, so that there's a civilian in charge of the military, so that the military can't overthrow the civilian government, which is probably a good move, probably. Typically it has been. And a declaration of war comes from Congress. Like the president can ask for one, but the Congress, both houses, have to approve it. So Congress doesn't want to give away its power or US autonomy over our troops. And it makes sense for all the reasons you guys have explained. So the Senate asked Woodrow Wilson, can we negotiate about this? And Wilson says, heck no, I'm Woodrow Wilson. I'm always right. No way, not going to happen. And then Wilson has the big stroke. And Wilson's unable to communicate or walk. So for about 4 months, Woodrow Wilson is incapacitated and he's president. So in the modern era, could we have the incapacitated president, the one who can't communicate or walk, but he would still get to be president for a few months? Do you think that could happen?
No.
I don't either.
No.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think so either. I wonder why it could happen back in the teens. Do you think it was good for us to have the incapacitated president?
Probably
No.
not.
I don't think so either. I wonder how he got away with that.
Popularity.
Could be. That's a good answer. Popularity. Might be up there with Billie Eilish. I'm going to try to remember her name.
I don't know. Sometimes if you're the president, doing nothing's better than doing something.
Okay, no, that's, and I think sometimes we feel that way politically. We just hope our elected officials don't do anything to make stuff worse. That's an interesting answer. I like it. I think maybe it also had to do with, like, President Trump. Do you ever see him on TV? Does he show up from time to time if you watch TV? Does the guy tweet? Is he in the news some? Do you think?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think Woodrow Wilson was tweeting? Do you think he was in the news? I think some of the difference is that in those days, you just didn't see the president that much. I'm not saying people didn't know there was something up, that they didn't know that maybe he was sick. I think they did, but because he wasn't a daily presence in the news, I think people just didn't see it in the same way. We also didn't have an amendment that says who takes over if the president can't run the show. We'd certainly had precedent that suggested the vice president would be in charge if the president were ill, or sick, and or died. And we'd certainly, we figured that one out. But we won't pass that amendment that establishes the succession of the presidency until much later, decades later. So Wilson kind of just stays out of the press, and people thought, oh, he's tired, he'd been overseas, he negotiated the treaty, the war was hard on him, and they just kind of left it alone. Your book has a little section where it talks about how probably his wife ran the country for a little while he was recovering from the stroke. And they did send papers to him to sign, or maybe laws, and people did notice that the signature looked different, but they thought, well, maybe that's just a result of the stroke, which it could have been. And if you wanted access to the president, the only way you got that was through the president's personal physician, or you got that through the president's wife. This is also why, I don't know if you notice stuff like this, because you're young and you're busy and stuff. You got 8 classes, you're in band or football, you got a job. Um, every once in a while, like once a year, we get a report from the president's physician that talks about his health. Part of the reason we get that is instances like this in history where a president was incapacitated and people didn't know. So now we get an official report about our president's health that happens once a year. Did you know that? President's health report once a year? You should get one of those at the high school for like the band director or the principal or something. That would be fun, right? All those people seem healthy though. All right. So Woodrow Wilson considers running for a third term, but doesn't because his health isn't good. The Treaty of Versailles does not get ratified by the United States, although it does continue for the member nations who were involved in the war. It does assess a war guilt and reparation of $33 billion to Germany, which it can't afford to pay. It does create a League of Nations, which most major nations don't join, so it's not terribly successful, but it is a predecessor to the United Nations, which is more successful than the League of Nations. We decide after Wilson's presidency that we've just kind of had enough of this sacrifice and save and scrimp so we can send food overseas to the Belgians and help the war effort and buy war bonds and be frugal, because we'd already done that for like a year and a half or two. We were done with that foolishness. So we'd also done that progressive era thing where we're trying to fix things and make things better, and we're always worried about how do you help the poor, how do you take care of kids. It's like, you know what, we're tired of taking care of everybody else. Let's just have a good time. And that's sort of the mood we're in after the Wilson presidency. After the progressive era in World War I, it's like, hey, let's just have some fun. So we got to elect a president that will help us have some fun. So we elect Warren G. Harding, who doesn't look very fun, but he does say when he's campaigning that he is pushing for a return to normalcy. Normalcy. So he makes up a word, which presidents often do. And your book will mention that this is a rejection of Wilsonism. We're tired of sacrifice and trying to, make the world safe for democracy and just make the place better. And we just want to kind of go back to normal where we just make money and buy stuff. So that's kind of where we're headed in the 20s. Plus, we'll not only just make money and buy stuff, we will dislike certain groups of people, especially European immigrants, because we've just gone through World War I, and we'll call it the Great War because we're not anticipating World War II. But who caused that thing? Bunch of crazy Europeans, bunch of anarchists, bunch of communists, bunch of socialists, bunch of people trying to take over their neighbors' countries. And they not just do that peacefully the way we did that to Mexico. Do they have to start a whole world war about it? So we do not want to interact militarily or politically with our European friends, and we're certainly not letting any more of them in our country. We've just had 30 million of them over the last several decades, no more. And we've already cut off immigration to Asia. There's no Asian country that we're really accepting immigrants from. So the only place we'll let you immigrate from, people who understand us, people who share our values, people whom we appreciate and love, yes, those would be Mexicans. So we are going to allow lots of Mexican immigration in the 20s, and we'll keep that up while the economy is good. It will also lead to a Red Scare. It's kind of a little one, not the one like you'll see in the 50s, but where we really hate communist, so anti-Soviet kind of thing. And we will also be concerned about anyone who will not assimilate. You gotta fit in. If you won't fit in, we don't trust you. We don't think you want to really be an American. It's kind of that if you don't like the United States, then go back to where you came from kind of feeling, sort of idea. And it also leads to a weird rise of the KKK. The KKK is going to promote itself as being very pro-American during this time period, very pro-assimilation, and they're not going to see themselves as a hate group. They're just very pro-US. So they want everyone else to be patriotic the way that they are, and also to favor prohibition. So the KKK is going to become important politically, especially in the Midwest and the South, and it will be really hard for you to either get elected or get a job as a police officer if you are not a member of some sort of law enforcement, because it could be sheriff, constable, other stuff. But as a law enforcement officer, unless you are a KKK member. Now, please don't leave this class today and say, Cerna said all law enforcement members are KKK members. I did not say that. I did not. I am saying that during this time period, that in certain parts of the country, that's going to become more important to be, if you want to be an elected official or if you want to be part of law enforcement. They're going to see that as a requirement because they're going to see that as you being patriotic. Now, by the end of the 20s, the KKK will go out of favor again, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's going to be really important in the 20s, really important. Okay, all right, so let me stop the share thing. Oh, there's chat, okay. Oh, I gotta know. Sorry that I didn't pay attention to when that happened. So I'm sure it was a good time to say no. All right, so before we end class today, which will be sad for all of us because I know it's your favorite part of the day, is there anything that you would like to ask? Do you have any concerns? Did you see you saw the list of things to start studying for the quiz? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, if you didn't, it's in the course documents section. That's usually where I stash stuff. And I think I've put all the questions in individually in case you're ready to answer them. I know some of you already have. I'm going to stop the recording, I think.